session is our very own SAF's Associate Professor Chris Anderson. Chris got his PhD. You need to hand that over. Slowly. He got his PhD in social science at the California Institute of Technology. He was on the East Coast at University of Rhode Island for a number of years. He then saw the error of his ways and came to SAF's, where he's been here for, hey, I get to do this sort of stuff, for the last 2-3 years now, it seems like. 2 years, where he's establishing a program in fisheries economics here in SAF's with links well across campus. Not only is he doing economics at an academic sense, this year he joined the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, SSC. His talk is Ecosystem-Based Businesses Managing for Economic Benefits in a Multispecies World, and he tells me that everything will be provocative.
Not everything, just some of the things. Thank you all very much for coming. You know, my own symposium in my home auditorium, and I've been called a dismal scientist already.
No, I'm an economist.
This morning, Bud called us all economists dismal scientists. Maybe I'm just sensitive. So what I want to do is look up a little bit from the fish in the water and think about the fishery from the perspective of the people and the businesses who participate in it. And I think there's an increasing recognition on the international stage that a healthy fishery requires more than just a healthy fish stock. All right. So we're also interested in having a healthy fishing industry, healthy fishing communities which support and are supported by that industry. And I want to take some time to review some statistics about how we're doing here on the West Coast and then ask, could we be doing better? So, not that one. Oops, let's do that one. So this is a place where we often start with asking whether or not the fishing industry is healthy. We ask how many people are participating in it. I'm going to show you a lot of slides that are going to have roughly this format. We have some information on Alaska on the top and some information on the Pacific fisheries on the bottom here. These are slides of participation, number of vessels, and you see that in both of these graphs, there's kind of a steady trend down. All right, now the dismal scientist has dismal news. But let me ask, is this really as bad as it looks? We knew that several years ago that these fisheries were overcapitalized. And we might be thinking about this as simply a proxy. There are a lot fewer airlines today than there were 10 years ago. But the industry is actually healthier. It's producing more value for society, and the number of people who are working in the industry hasn't declined that much. So is this an adequate proxy for the value that we're producing for society? Is this a proxy for the number of people who are active in fishing? And does leaving one fishery, which is what this captures, is this really, does that mean people are leaving fishing? So here's the value that we're producing for society. You see that this is, this is landing value in both Alaska and in the Pacific. There's sort of a weak increasing trend here and a pretty strong increasing trend here. We're landing more and more valuable fish. There's a number of trends going on here. The demand for food is higher. All food products are rising in price around the world. We're improving our processing and our product quality, so we're bringing better products to market and people are paying more for them. We've also have some effective catch share programs where we're improving market timing, so we're getting longer seasons and extracting more value from fresh products. And we're coming up with higher value product forms. Now, one thing this points to is that the post-harvest sector matters. All right? The people who do the processing and the selling, they're generating a lot of value too. how much is that relative to what the vessels are making? Well, here, this kind of data is really hard to come by, surprisingly hard to come by. So here's a report for Alaska that suggests the number of commercial fishing workers. We can look at the full-time equivalent number there, and the amount of labor income. And we can compare that to the processing industry. And what we see is that processing is more than half the value. Catching the fish, well, that's about 45% of the value. Processing generates even more value than that. That's fine. I don't want a whole flopping fish. I'm willing to pay somebody to process that for me. And it's a meaningful portion of the labor income and a meaningful portion of the employment. So if we look at this industry as a whole, it's actually quite large and provides a lot of benefit to society. Here's another example of another way to look at the processing. This is from the EDR reports from West Coast processors. We see in blue here for individual species across 4 years. Blue is the amount that they pay for the fish, the ex-vessel price, and then red is the amount, the difference between what they pay for the fish and the wholesale value, what they sell it for. You see that it varies from fish to fish, how much additional rents the processors generate, but it is significant in most fish. And this industry is also pretty healthy. Employment is actually increasing. This is Alaska seafood processing. And the amount that they're paying to workers, wages, are also increasing. So all taken together, this suggests that our fishing industry is reasonably healthy. And the changes that we're seeing in the stocks, where we're seeing rebuilding, are also leading to economic improvements in the fishery. Now I want to turn the question around and say, looking forward to this reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, is fishing realizing its economic potential? Could we do better? And the focal point here is a theme that has emerged in several of the talks this afternoon about the difference between designating status and setting total allowable catches based on single species in fisheries where the businesses depend on multiple species. All right? And this leads to two mismatches between the scope of management and the scope of the businesses that are being regulated. One is the multi-species problem. This we've heard about. Fisheries management plans often connect multiple species. So we have joint production on mixed stocks, and this leads to bycatch, prohibited species problems, and choke species problems. I want to put some dollars on the size of that problem. The other is what I'm going to call the multi-fishery problem. And this we haven't heard very much about. This is where individual business operations participate in completely different fishery management plans during the year. And as a result, when we change one management plan, that influences their opportunities to participate in other fisheries where they also try to make money. And what I'm going to argue is that we need a shift in perspective that's comparable to that of ecosystem-based management on the biological side. And this is where the ecosystem-based business comes in. We need to think about managing these businesses as entities that operate across multiple fisheries. All right? And they're structured and have evolved to depend on a whole ecosystem across broad geographical areas of harvested products. All right, let me start with the multi-species problem. And one of the effects of the multi-species problem is underfishing. Anna showed us these graphs. I have broken out, and she's conveniently taught you to read them. So I have broken out, compliments of Ray Hilborn, the Alaska stocks and the West Coast stocks. And I've blown up those dots, which were all exactly the same size in the previous plots we've seen, to be proportional to BMSY. So bigger stocks are bigger dots. And we heard the red area down here, where we have both low levels of fishing effort and high levels of biomass, as being kind of a happy zone. Well, I believe that we're kind of happy here in Rick's pretty good yield region. Over here, you're happy only if you're not interested in making money catching fish. Because if you've got 3 times BMSY here, and this is a valuable stock, this is a lot of money left in the water. All right. Now, let's put some number. There are a number of reasons that this happens. Some of this is on the management side, where there's precaution or possibly even excessive precaution. Some of this might be that it's not economical to harvest some of these species. And another is that there's joint harvest with limiting species that prevent us from fully exploiting some of these species. We are working on sorting that out for the species in this graph now. So what does this add up to? Let's just look at the total allowable catches that are set now. And what I've got here is a graph that shows the 100% of the total allowable catch. The blue is the section that is caught, and the red is the section that is uncaught at the end of 2012. This is the West Coast Trawl ITQ program. This number here, after the name of the fish, is the number of millions of dollars that the red area is worth and was not landed at current market prices. You add all these numbers up, you get $50 million. How much was the quota that was landed worth? $50 million. Half the value of the fishery is left in the water. Percentage-wise, we do a little better in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. But the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands is worth a little bit more. So we end up leaving $300 to $500 million in the water. This is the total of the total allowable catch. And in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, the ABCs are much more than the total allowable catch because of the 2 million ton cap. So, what do we do about this problem? We've heard a couple ideas, technology. When I as a social scientist look at this notion of optimum yield, I have a hard time getting to this MSY right away. I think that's a biologist's reading of this. And Steve did a really nice job explaining how it's really difficult to get to optimum yield for each species in a jointly harvested stock, so when you're harvesting multiple species. So how are we supposed to provide the greatest overall benefit to the nation? That's something that I think I, as an economist, a social scientist, I understand. And follow me here for a minute. And I want to kind of remind you that the appeal of MSY, as it's laid out in Rick's graphs, in the single species case, is that we're not wasting anything. We're getting as much out of that single stock as we possibly can. Right? MSY is not reflective of ratios of virgin stock biomasses in the water. It's a human-chosen construct. We could choose a different construct that achieved a different objective. So in these multiple species stocks, MSY can end up being wasteful because we can end up trying to rebuild window pane flounder to MSY and leaving tremendous amount of valuable and important fish in the water. Right? So what makes sense in a single species world doesn't make sense in a multi-species world because MSY is now wasteful. Now, Steve mentioned at the end of his talk this mixed stock exception. All right, as he pointed out, this is something that's in the current regulations, but it's not currently operational. And the reason for that is it's been interpreted by the courts as not applying to the need to rebuild. And sort of unsurprisingly, all the stocks where this would be most important are the ones that need to be rebuilt. So the idea is that in order to intentionally overfish something, we first have to rebuild it. Now, there's two problems with this. One is that this is labeled an exception. This mixed stock concept, I think, should be the norm if we're actually going to go for optimum yield. Secondly, it's phrased as intentionally overfishing. Remember that post-harvest sector that's good at generating all this value? You know what they're going to tell you? I don't want anything that's labeled as intentionally overfished because the wallet cards are going to come up with a new category. And the fish at the top of the page is going to be black and iridescent, and it's going to have sad eyes for all the fish that are caught with intentionally overfished stocks. All right, so what do we do about this? Is that actually my next? So I want to echo Rick's suggestion that we need a holistic and positive and affirmative statement of ecosystem-based notion of sustainable optimum yield for mixed stock fisheries. We need to recognize that healthy fisheries involve healthy industries and recognize this is a source of food and community livelihoods. I think this language is largely in the MSA, and it's just not interpreted that way. Ecosystem-based management, I think, provides a reasonable framework here. We can define a complete set of technologically plausible, sustainable removals. I think it's dangerous to continue to apply the overfish designation to individual stocks within a mixed stock complex. And I think we can integrate trophic relationships, including things like nesting forage fish, as we're asking what's feasible long-term for a mixed stock fishery. One of the cop-outs we can ask for in the renewal is we can say, well, I don't really know, but they, in several places, call for NRC panels. So maybe we need an NRC panel to think about how to actually implement this. Now, if I were to do this, a couple of details. Identify sustainable first step would be to identify sustainable mixed stock removals. Think of this as joint production. I'm not picking the amount of any individual species. I'm picking a vector of all the species that are targeted by these businesses. And we're going to apply the best available science to ensure the removals are jointly sustainable. We're causing capture trophic relationships, such as the forage fish regulations. And we're going to allow some stocks to be below MSY, but still sustainable. We can also integrate other ecosystem considerations. Now, how low can individual stocks go? The mixed stock exception, there's been a couple interpretations over the years. In the 1998 interpretation, all it had to be was clear of the Endangered Species Act. That was reinterpreted to be 50% of BMSY in 2009. We've heard that there are different notions. We heard from Sam, there's different notions of important fisheries, important stocks, both to harvesters and to the environment. We might think about vulnerability and the role and importance in ecosystem function. Then we'd describe a set of technically plausible removals. We'd select ACLs that support sustainable volumes and harvest compositions that provide the greatest contribution to the fishery-dependent community. So this is a sort of technologically and human-defined objective. And this could be defined by the local councils. On the industry side, we notice here that because we're concerned about what's technically feasible, the production technology affects the established ACLs. This should preserve incentives to target. We want to maintain avoidance incentives, and we've seen that catch share programs can do this, technology can do this. We've seen that cooperatives can work together to do this as well. And we'd want to monitor the implementation. All right, so that's a little food for thought on the multi-species problem. Let's talk about the multi-fishery problem. What I want to present to you is some evidence that, fishing businesses, ecosystem-based businesses, participate in multiple fisheries. And talk a little bit about why they do that. And then talk about what that means for both how we do analysis of management. Importantly, we miss both positive and negative consequences of management programs. And talk about how we can change management to accommodate some of the effects of fishing in multiple fisheries. So here's the extent of multi-fishery participation in the Pacific Limited Entry Trawl fleet. These are the number of active fisheries. These vessels, in addition to participating in the limited entry groundfish fishery, they will participate in the shrimp fishery, the crab fishery. Some of them go up to Alaska. And you see that not very many of them just participate in one fishery. All right. And these fisheries are importantly separately managed. Now, interestingly, when we're counting fisheries here, one of the obstacles we face is that all the Pacific Council can ask of these people is whether they fish in Alaska, not how many Alaska fisheries they participate in. So Alaska is one of these fisheries. Here's a somewhat different take on it, not just the number of fisheries, but where the income comes from. So this is a paper Steve Kaspersky and Dan Holland had in PNAS. They looked at the Alaska crab fishery, the halibut and sable fishery, and the West Coast groundfish fishery, and calculated a Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is the basically for each fishery looks at the percentage of the fisherman's or the business's income that comes from that fishery and squares it and adds that up. So if you just participate in one fishery, you have an HHI of 10,000. Not very many businesses. All right? If your income is evenly divided between two fisheries, you're down here. This is much more common. If your income is split 50, 25, 25, you have a yet lower Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So people are not only spread across for their activity, they're spread across, their income is importantly distributed. So the multi-fishery problem here is that ecosystem-based businesses react to management across fisheries. I found a good literature on spillover into unregulated fisheries, where we have to, the theme there is we have to be careful when we manage fishery X, because if we cut down on the number of vessels that are participating in that, they'll just all go chase species Y, which is unregulated, and then they'll overfish that. There's much less information on how, when you change a regulation in fishery X, the vessels go into regulated fishery Z, and what happens there. One of the patterns that's emerged in a number of studies is that catch share programs increase the flexibility to participate in other fisheries, and these effects can actually dominate the effect in the fishery that's converted to catch shares. So here's an analysis that I and one of my students did, looking at the effect of the New England Multispecies Catch Share program that Steve introduced us to at the end of his talk. And these vessels participate in an enormous number of different management plans. So the New England Multispecies Catch Share program went to the Catch Share sector program. The benefits from that in dollars are in the red here. The total gains coming from participation in, or changes in participation in other fisheries exceeded those from the way they changed their landings of multi-species fishery. Okay? So if we'd only looked at that one fishery, we would have missed half the benefits of the program. Another way that this can manifest itself is bringing us back to that my opening graph on decreasing participation. If we look at who was leaving the limited entry trawl fleet here in the West Coast, and we look to see if they're still fishing. Well, so the blue line here is the total number of vessels that left in a 2-year period. The red ones are fishing in other fisheries. They're leasing their quota and participating in other fisheries. Right? So what we're seeing here is an effect of specialization, not necessarily leaving fisheries. So maybe we should look at those participation graphs a little bit differently. So what does this mean for MSA? Magnuson-Stevens Act does not, as far as I can tell, recognize participation in multiple fisheries, nor does the structure of the way that we analyze fisheries. But I think for analysis and monitoring, if we're going to keep track of our progress on National Standard 8, we need to capture benefits and costs across fisheries. So National Standard 8 has us looking at the fishing businesses and the fishing communities. So we need to know the total benefits and the total costs as we, of management changes in individual fisheries. A side note here is that in the stock models that we have, all right, those rigor curves tell us if we had a higher stock, what we'd expect the yield to be. Or if we had a higher level of effort, what we'd expect the sustainable yield to be. When you're dealing with businesses that respond strategically, you need a more sophisticated counterfactual model to understand the effects of policies. All right? And I think we don't do that enough. Too often the default when you're looking at social and economic data is that there wouldn't have been any change. But that's not necessarily the case. It's possible the people on the previous slide who were leaving the fishery would have left anyway. It's possible they could have left in a greater rate. We don't know unless we model that participation decision. Now, how would we modify the MSA, or how could MSA changes help us here? First, we could look at some better standards for data that allow us to track business activity across fisheries. This is very, very difficult right now. It's very difficult to track from one region to another. It's very, very difficult to get information on activity. Some of the EDR programs have helped a lot. You've noticed I've drawn a lot on EDR data here. That's because that data doesn't exist for other fisheries. And we can improve coordination with state fisheries and fisheries in different council regions. So now let's turn to the question of why diversification happens. So this is also from Kaspersky in Holland. And what they find is as the Herfindahl index gets higher, which means as you're more concentrated in a single fishery, the coefficient of variation of total business revenue goes up. So this means that it's risky to your business income to be concentrated in a single fishery. Right? You don't want to have your entire retirement portfolio in a single stock. You want to diversify. Same thing is true in fisheries. You don't want to be tied up with a single fish stock or a single fishery. You want to diversify. The reasons that businesses might do this. They want to keep fishing in the off-season of a primary fishery. They might want to mitigate fluctuating tax or management risk. They may want to mitigate market risk as prices change differently in different fisheries. But the bottom line is that it's riskier to be concentrated in a single fishery. Now we're worried again about those people who specialized. What do we do about that? So if our ecosystem-based businesses participate in multiple fisheries in order to mitigate some risk and we need to think about what opportunities we're providing them to continue to mitigate risk. So one thing that we know is that these businesses seem to be almost excessively risk sensitive within individual fisheries. And this is actually one of the drivers of leaving some of that quota in the water. Excessive risk aversion. The risk pools that are set up here on the West Coast have established best practices for avoiding bycatch. They're also causing people to avoid target catch. And the result here can be dramatic under-harvest, low utilization of the stocks, and low income. So what are the bottom lines here? What do we want to do about this? We see that MSA catch share programs have increased flexibility and that harvesters have taken advantage of it, except the allocation of catch shares locks people into historic participation patterns. And this exposes them to risk because people can't focus more on fisheries that they haven't participated in much in the past, in low bycatch years. They can't focus on high abundance fisheries in particular years, in years of high abundance, and they can't focus on fisheries that are having particularly good market years. So they're kind of locked into where they are participating in their historical portfolio. So in particular, when we're dealing with bycatch species or species of low importance, we can talk about using multi-year targets for high variance species that'll smooth risk of bycatch encounters over time. We can talk about transferability of quotas across fleets and sectors. This could be especially useful for bycatch or PSC species. And this will limit the effect of institutionalizing gear groups. I think in Alaska in particular and down here on the West Coast, we have cases where we've separated fleets by the gear that they've historically used. We want to make sure that people who trawl can hold on to a certain amount of quota and people who pot fish can hold on to a certain amount of quota. Except one of the strategies for managing your bycatch is to change gear. And we can introduce flexibility there and allow groups that have different rates of encountering bycatch to trade that across fleets or sectors. We can also look at methods of managing catch risk that are other than hard tax in a single year. This could include deemed value systems and doing things like the risk pools here on the West Coast. So, to summarize, our ecosystem-based businesses depend both on mixed stocks in the same fishery and on multiple fisheries. The catch share programs supported by the Magnuson-Stevens Act have increased this flexibility, and as a result, harvesters have enjoyed greater revenues in both catch share fisheries and the non-catch share fisheries in which they also participate, which is kind of cool. The post-harvest sector has benefited from this through the ability to scale capacity, make higher value products through increased season length, and develop better and more reliable market channels. If we want to continue to improve the performance of our fishing industry, we're going to have to understand that these businesses act across fisheries. And they're the source that creates the economic and social value from the stocks. So we need to do this in a way that acknowledges the successes that MSA has provided in curtailing overfishing and assuring healthy stocks, but also think that a revision here could unlock some well-known sources of foregone harvest. And that can help us monitor some national standards where I think we could be doing better, in particular those related to social goals, and can help us reduce business risk. All right? So a lot of different ideas here, but my goal and my hope is that the upcoming revision of the Magnuson-Stevens Act will help us realize sustainable businesses and sustainable communities in addition to sustainable fish stocks. Thank you.